The morning Crispin Aldrich stood at the front of the all-hands meeting and announced that Odette Nkosi was being moved into an advisory capacity. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the building's ventilation system. The same system she had personally optimized 3 years earlier, when the servers started running hot and the building manager had told her it would take 3 weeks to get a technician in. She had fixed it herself in an afternoon. Nobody in the room raised a hand. Nobody asked what advisory capacity meant in practice, or whether Odette had agreed to it, or what would happen to the government climate modeling contract that accounted for nearly half the company's annual revenue. The 41 people seated in that conference room simply looked at their laptops, at the table, at anything, except the woman sitting near the back in a dark green pullover and worn canvas sneakers, her hands folded in her lap, her expression entirely unreadable. Crispin was 32 years old, newly appointed by the board, after what he called a strategic reorganization, and he spoke about the future of Athon Analytics with the kind of certainty that only came from never having built something from nothing. He had 3 degrees, 2 from McGill and 1 from Harvard Business School. And he had been hired specifically because the board felt the company had outgrown what they privately called a founder dependency. Too much of the company's institutional knowledge, they had decided, lived inside a single person's head. That was a liability. What they needed was systems, documentation, scalability. What they meant, without quite saying so, was that they needed someone whose success could be explained in a slide deck. Odette had not built Athon Analytics with slide decks. She had built it at a folding table in a 1-bedroom apartment in Scarborough, working nights after a day job at a telecommunications company where she had spent 8 years being passed over for promotions that went instead to colleagues whose work she had quietly corrected, whose errors she had fixed before they reached the client, whose names appeared on reports she had effectively written. She had no university degree. She had a library card, a second-hand programming textbook, and an appetite for problems that other people had already decided were unsolvable. The original system, what would eventually become the climate analytics platform, now used by Emergency Management Canada to track wildfire spread in real time, had started as a personal project she built to analyze weather pattern data after her cousin's home near Kelowna was destroyed in a fire that the provincial warning system had flagged too late. She had not been trying to build a company. She had been trying to understand why good data consistently failed to produce useful warnings at the moment people needed them most. The answer, she eventually discovered, was not in the data itself. It was in how the data was ingested. The timing, the weighting, the way atmospheric feeds from different monitoring stations were reconciled when they contradicted each other. She spent 18 months writing a calibration method that nobody had formally designed because the problem had never been formally acknowledged as a problem in the first place. That method became the foundation of Athon Analytics. By the time Crispin arrived with his reorganization plans and his talk about scalability, the company employed 230 people across 3 offices, held a federal government contract worth close to $2 billion over 10 years, and had been named in industry publications as one of Canada's most important climate technology firms. Odette owned 40% of it. On paper, she was a billionaire. In practice, she still preferred to be in the server room before anyone else arrived in the morning, running diagnostics by hand, checking the seasonal calibration parameters she adjusted every quarter based on shifting atmospheric baselines that the automated systems could not account for on their own. The younger engineers who discovered her there in the early hours always seemed unsure whether to say good morning or pretend they hadn't seen her. Unsure what category she belonged to, whether founder or technician or executive or something that didn't fit any of those labels neatly. She had never asked them to understand. She simply did the work. Crispin reviewed her personnel summary in his first week and came away puzzled. No formal education, no publications, No patents filed under her name, even though several of the company's core methods could trace their origins directly to her notebooks. The system worked. He could see that from the performance data, but he could not understand why it worked, or how to explain that to the board, in terms that didn't make the entire company sound like it was one resignation away from collapse. He brought in 8 data scientists over the following month. They came from the University of Toronto, from Waterloo, from a climate modeling team at Oxford, and another at MIT. Each one carried an impressive list of publications. Each one had built careers designing elegant algorithmic systems inside carefully controlled research environments. They arrived with matching Aethon lanyards on their first day and spoke in the language of neural networks and ensemble modeling, with the easy fluency of people who had never had to make a system work under pressure in the middle of a wildfire season. Crispin gathered the full company in the main meeting room and told them that Aethon had entered a new phase. The era of relying on any single individual's institutional knowledge, he said, was over. They were building something that could outlast any one person. They were building infrastructure. The 8 new experts stood at the front of the room behind him, and Crispin gestured toward them the way someone might gesture toward a new piece of equipment. Odette stood near the back of the room, arms folded loosely across her chest. She did not look angry. She looked to the few people who glanced at her, like someone who had already done the math and was simply waiting for the answer to become apparent to everyone else. She spent the following 2 days quietly and methodically. She made a complete list of every open calibration parameter in the system, annotated her handwritten seasonal notebooks with as much detail as she could render in written language, and left them in a box outside the server room with a note asking whoever found them to please keep them together and in order. She sent personal messages to the engineers she had worked most closely with over the years. She thanked them for specific things. The late night, a junior developer named Joel had caught a data feed error that could have corrupted an entire season's projection model. The morning, a server technician had called her at 6 a.m. because something sounded wrong, and she had known, before she even walked in the door, exactly which rack was running too warm. She did not make a speech. She did not leave a letter for Crispin. She carried her canvas bag of notebooks out through the lobby on a Thursday afternoon, nodded to the security desk, and walked to her car in the parking garage the same way she had walked to it 10,000 times before, unhurried, without ceremony. The building felt different before the elevator doors had even closed behind her, though no one could have said precisely why. The 8 expert data scientists moved into the technical leadership structure of Aethon Analytics with professional confidence. Their mandate was clear: modernize the architecture, reduce single-point dependencies, document everything. They ran the first quarter's calibration, using the automated pipeline they had designed, which pulled seasonal adjustment parameters from a machine learning model trained on historical atmospheric data. Every diagnostic they ran confirmed the system was healthy. The servers reported normal operating temperatures. The error logs were clean. The data feeds from Environment and Climate Change Canada were ingesting properly. 7 weeks later, in the middle of August, the system went dark. It did not crash dramatically. It did not throw errors or trigger alerts. It simply stopped producing accurate projections. The wildfire risk mapping tool that Emergency Management Canada used to coordinate aerial suppression resources began generating outputs that were 8 to 12 hours behind actual fire spread patterns. Close enough to look plausible, wrong enough to be dangerous. It took 3 days for the Federal Operations Center to notice the discrepancy. It was a regional coordinator in northern British Columbia who first flagged it after the system's projected containment boundary for a fire near Williams Lake was overtaken by the actual fire line before the projected breach window had even opened. She called the federal director directly. The federal director called Aethon. The 8 experts went to work immediately, pulling every log, every server metric, every algorithm parameter they could access. Everything read as normal. The automated calibration had run correctly, according to its own records. The training data was intact. The ensemble model was producing outputs on schedule. There was no obvious failure, no corrupted dataset, no misconfigured pipeline. The system was, by every available measure, doing exactly what they had designed it to do. And yet the projections were wrong. They replaced the ensemble model entirely, rerunning training on the historical dataset from scratch. They audited every data feed connection from the monitoring stations. They brought in an external firm to inspect the server hardware for thermal issues. They ran the calibration pipeline 3 more times, each time with additional logging enabled, each time producing outputs that still failed to match ground truth. 2 of the younger scientists began quietly blaming different components of the architecture. The more experienced ones grew very still and very focused. The way people do when they begin to suspect the problem might be something they don't yet have a category for. Crispin watched from the glass-walled conference room above the operations floor, saying very little. He had promised the board that the restructuring would eliminate dependency risks. He had told the federal government's contract manager, in their last quarterly review, that the system's architecture had been strengthened and diversified. He had used the phrase institutional knowledge redundancy in at least 2 presentations. None of those words were available to him now, when what the contract actually required was a functioning system, and what he had was 8 very credentialed people unable to find a problem they could name. The federal director called again on the 5th day. Her voice was precise and controlled, the voice of someone who was not yet angry but was making an active effort to remain not angry. She reminded Crispin that the 10-year contract included performance benchmarks and that a failure window of 5 or more days during active fire season constituted a reportable incident under the agreement terms. She did not mention the review clause. She did not need to. Crispin spent that night in the office. He asked his assistant to pull every performance record attached to the climate modeling system, going back to the company's founding. It was nearly midnight when he began reading through the older documents, the quarterly calibration reports from years before the new team's arrival. And he noticed something that had not registered when he first reviewed the company records. The reports were always filed by different engineers. Different department heads had signed off on them over the years. But at the bottom of every single one, in a column labeled Technical Verification, there was one name, written in the same small, even handwriting, appearing without fail across 6 years of quarterly records. Odette had personally verified every single calibration cycle the system had ever run. Not as a formality, not as a rubber stamp, as the actual technical sign-off in a column that the current team had not even known existed until Crispin found it at midnight in a records folder nobody had opened in 18 months. Harold, one of the senior operations engineers who had been with the company since its 4th year, was the one who found the notebooks the following morning. He had spent the previous day quietly rereading old technical memos. Following a hunch he had not been able to fully articulate, and when he opened the box, Odette had left outside the server room, still sitting exactly where she had placed it. He sat down on the floor of the hallway and read through the first notebook for 2 uninterrupted hours. What he found was not documentation in any conventional sense. It was more like a record of a conversation Odette had been having with the system for years. Detailed, handwritten observations about how the servers behaved in different seasons, about a specific thermal asymmetry in the 3rd rack from the left that the sensors never caught cleanly, about a timing offset in the atmospheric ingestion process that had to be corrected manually every quarter because it drifted slightly as the hardware aged and no automated system had ever been calibrated to account for it. The notebooks described exactly what to look for, in what order, and what to adjust. But only if you already understood why the adjustment mattered, which required understanding a design decision Odette had made in the company's 3rd year that had never been formally documented anywhere. Harold brought the notebooks to Crispin's office, and laid them open on the desk without saying much. He let Crispin read for a few minutes, then told him quietly that he thought he understood what was wrong with the system. The automated calibration pipeline the new team had built was technically correct. It did everything it had been designed to do. But it had been designed without knowing the system had a quirk, a small consistent hardware drift that Odette had compensated for manually every single quarter for 6 years. The way a musician might tune an old instrument by ear rather than by tuner, because they had learned long ago that the tuner and the instrument didn't quite agree. The automated pipeline didn't know the quirk existed. The sensors didn't report it. The logs didn't capture it. Odette had never written it down in any format the new team could have found, not because she was protecting the knowledge, but because she had simply never imagined that anyone would build a replacement system without first asking her a single question about how the original one actually worked. It took another full day to track down where she was. No one in the company had kept her personal contact information after the transition, and the number on file with HR had been disconnected. It was Joel, the same junior engineer she had mentioned in her farewell messages, who remembered her talking about consulting work for remote communities in Northern Ontario. He called a colleague he knew in that sector, who knew someone who had worked with a small data infrastructure project near Sudbury, who mentioned that Odette Nkosi had been helping them build a local climate monitoring network for the past 2 months, entirely pro bono. Crispin drove up himself. He took the 400 North out of Toronto on a gray Tuesday morning, past Barrie, past Parry Sound, following directions to a community center in a small town where Odette was running a workshop on data literacy for local emergency responders. He sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going in, which was not something he typically did. He found her in a classroom with 12 people, pointing at a projected spreadsheet and explaining, in plain language with no jargon, how to read a temperature inversion pattern in atmospheric data. She saw him when he came through the door. She did not look surprised. She finished the sentence she was in the middle of, excused herself, and walked over with the same unhurried calm she had always carried. He told her what had happened, all of it. The system failure, the 8 experts, the federal government's review clause, the 5 days of failed attempts to find a problem that every diagnostic insisted did not exist. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she shook her head and told him she wasn't coming back. Her voice was not cold or bitter. It was simply clear. The same clarity she had always had when she spoke about something she had already thought through. He asked her, carefully, why she had never fought back when the board had decided to phase her out. She had owned 40% of the company. She could have made the transition very difficult for them. She had chosen not to. She set down the marker she had been holding and told him something she had never spoken aloud, in any meeting or review, in the years she had spent at Athen. 12 years earlier, in the early months of the company, she had designed the core atmospheric ingestion method, the one that had made every accurate projection the system had ever produced possible. A climate scientist who came on as a short-term advisor had taken that method, rewritten it in academic language, and published it under his own name in a peer-reviewed journal. He had not mentioned her, not in the acknowledgments, not in the footnotes, not in passing at the conference where the paper was presented to a room of people who would go on to cite it for years. She had found out 2 months after it was published from a colleague who assumed she already knew. She had not filed a complaint. She had not contacted the journal or the conference organizers or the scientist himself. She had gone back to her office in the Scarborough apartment she was still working out of at the time, opened a new notebook, and kept building, not because she didn't care, but because the method existed, and the work it made possible was real. And that mattered more to her than her name appearing on paper. Crispin stood in the doorway of that community center classroom and was quiet for longer than he was accustomed to being quiet. He asked her what it would take for her to come back. She told him no raise, No equity adjustment, no new title. One condition only. Before she touched a single server, the company had to commit to building a formal knowledge transfer program, a structured process by which anyone who held critical technical knowledge would spend time each quarter documenting it in a form others could actually use and would be compensated specifically for that work, not just for the outputs it produced. She wanted institutional memory treated as infrastructure, not as an inconvenient liability to be engineered away. He agreed without hesitating, which surprised her slightly. She came back on a Wednesday morning. The operations floor was quieter than usual when she walked through the front door, in the same green pullover, carrying the same canvas bag. Word had circulated. People who had been at their desks stood up, without quite deciding to, the way people do when something shifts in a room before they can name what it is. She walked directly to the server room. The 8 data scientists were gathered near the diagnostics, with the particular posture of people who had been awake for too many days and were no longer certain what they were looking for. She nodded to them, said nothing specifically, and moved to the third rack from the left. She opened a terminal. She ran a sequence of 4 commands she had written herself years earlier, before the server room had been a server room, and was still a converted supply closet in an office she had rented by the month because the annual lease had felt like too much to commit to. The commands addressed the thermal asymmetry directly, walked the system through a manual resynchronization of the atmospheric ingestion timing, and reset the calibration offset to a value she held in her memory, the way her father had held the measurements of every table he ever built in his woodshop in Scarborough, without writing them down, because he simply knew. The sequence took less than 4 minutes. The projections came back online. Accurate, current, aligned with the ground data from British Columbia within the margin the system had maintained consistently for 6 years. One of the data scientists, a young woman from Waterloo, who had been awake for 36 hours, exhaled audibly and then looked immediately self-conscious about it. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. They all just watched the output screens update in real time and understood. In the specific way you understand something you cannot put neatly into words, that they had spent 5 days and considerable collective intelligence looking for a problem in the wrong place, in the wrong language, because none of them had known to ask the right question. Crispin was standing at the back of the server room. He did not reach for his phone to call the board. He did not make a statement. He watched Odette close the terminal and straighten up, and he felt something shift in how he understood the word expertise. Not the credential, not the publication record, but the thing itself, the actual lived accumulation of attention and problem solving and willingness to stay in a room with a broken thing until you understood it well enough to fix it. The all-hands meeting he called the following morning was different from the one he had held months earlier. He stood at the same front of the same conference room, but he had no notes prepared, and his posture was different, less positioned, somehow. He told the room plainly that he had confused having a system with understanding one, and that he had made a decision about the company's future without consulting the person who best understood its present. He said he had evaluated people using a framework that rewarded what could be cited and credentialed, and overlooked what could only be demonstrated and learned over years of showing up. He did not use the word mistake as a euphemism for anything. He used it directly and sat down. The 8 data scientists, rather than feeling diminished by what had happened, did something that changed the tone of the months that followed. One by one, over the next few weeks, they came to Odette separately, not as a group, not with any ceremony, and asked if she would be willing to walk them through the system the way she understood it, not the documented version, the real one. Harold was the first to ask, sitting across from her in the break room, with his coffee growing cold, telling her that her 4-line command sequence had done more to clarify the architecture than anything he had read in 18 months of internal documentation. She said yes. She said yes to all of them. What grew out of those conversations did not have an official name for the first few months. It was simply time, engineers and scientists and technicians sitting together, comparing what was written down with what was known, asking questions that crossed the usual hierarchies, finding that the people who had built something and the people who had been trained to improve it understood different halves of the same picture. Crispin formalized it eventually, but the structure had been forming long before his memo named it. 3 innovations came out of those joint sessions in the first year alone, each one emerging from a conversation that would never have happened under the old arrangement. Ideas from the server room, informing the algorithm. Ideas from the algorithm, informing the server room, neither side assuming the other had nothing to teach. Odette accepted a title, eventually. She had not wanted one, but the request had come in writing, signed by people across both the technical and operations sides of the company, and she accepted it for that reason rather than for what it meant on a business card. Director of Systems Architecture and Knowledge. She kept the green pullovers. She kept the notebooks. She kept arriving before most people and staying until the building felt like it had settled properly for the night. On the day the federal contract came up for its annual review, the government director who had made the worried call to Crispin in August sat through the presentation in the Ethan boardroom and then said, before leaving, that she had noticed the system's accuracy margins had returned to their 6-year historical average. She asked what had changed. Crispin said they had reinvested in their foundational architecture. Odette, sitting to his left, said nothing, which was what she had always preferred. Later that evening, after the building had emptied out, Crispin found her in the server room running what had become her standard end-of-season check. Not because the automated system required it, but because she had learned, from her father and from years of stubbornly staying with hard problems, that the most important check was the one you ran yourself, with your own eyes and your own judgment, before you trusted the readout. He asked her, hesitantly, what she was actually listening for when she ran those sequences by hand, what it was that the sensors consistently failed to measure. She thought about it for a moment, in the particular way she thought, not performing consideration, but actually considering. She told him that a system, like a person, would always show you the truth of itself if you paid attention long enough and stayed humble enough to believe what you were seeing rather than what you expected to see. Diagnostics told you what was happening, she said. Only patience told you why. He wrote that down. In the years that followed, the knowledge transfer program Odette had made the condition of her return became one of the things Aethon Analytics was most specifically known for in the Canadian technology sector, a model that other companies began adapting, imperfectly, in their own ways. None of that occupied much of her attention. She had other problems to work on. There were always other problems. She still arrived early. She still carried the same canvas bag. The notebooks had multiplied over the years into 2 full shelves in the server room, each one dense with observations that existed nowhere in any formal system, and that she was finally, carefully, beginning to teach other people to read. Not because the knowledge required a keeper, but because it deserved to outlast her, the way anything worth building deserved to outlast the hands that first put it together.